I think the idea with the eye is really like, well, what's the agenda? It gets into your brain, and then why? What does it want to accomplish, you know?
The idea of isolation is prevalent through the Alien series. In space, no one can hear you scream, often because there's nobody left to hear you scream. That theme also extends to the idea of what life awaits for us beyond the stars. Beside the odd mention of one or two other species, and, of course, the xenomorphs themselves, it has long seemed like humans are mostly alone in the Alien universe. But FX's Alien Earth is here to put an S on the end of Alien again. Not by James Cameron's methods of throwing multiple xenomorphs at us, but by introducing an array of new species to the franchise. To learn more, we spoke to series creator and director Noah Hawley, who explained exactly what kind of grotesque feelings he wanted to evoke with his new creatures. And while the show's unique aliens are very different from the classic xenomorph, it turns out that they were born of the very same idea: the horror of watching the unknown unfold.
I think the question is really, the discovery process, right? Because a xenomorph is not one creature, it's four. It starts as an egg, and the wholly iconic facehugger, which if that was just the creature, would be terrifying and disturbing, and then the idea that it's laid a different embryo inside of you and that bursts, so it's like it's a cumulative effect when you finally get to this 10-foot tall monster and it opens its mouth and there's a second mouth and you're like, what the crap with this stuff? It's like it just gets worse and worse. So those are the questions of like, well, how does it breed? How do they reproduce? What do they eat, etc. The Voyage of Discovery I got to go on to say like, all right, well, how much worse can we make it in its next iteration? And understanding that these creatures don't have to maintain the form that they originate in, it gives you a lot of leeway.
Many of the new creatures feel distinctly more animal or insectoid than the more traditionally monstrous xenomorph. The ticks, for instance, are clearly inspired by the ticks of our own planet. It's just that these ones turn into engorged blood bags as they drain a human of their entire hemoglobin supply. It was from recognizable roots then that Hawley developed his little legion of horrors.
What are the other elements of a sort of genetic revulsion that we feel about parasites and insects and things we can't see, and how do these creatures fit thematically into the show? Why are they in there? What am I using them for? What might I use them for in the future?
The different origin points of these aliens meant that they were disconnected from the xenomorphs, so the design team could pursue very different aesthetics. Thus far, the Alien universe has thrived on its gothic biomechanical visuals, designed back in the 1970s by H.R. Giger, largely due to the fact that the series has exclusively focused on the xenomorphs themselves. But in Alien Earth, each species has a unique appearance, and there's not even a hint of ribbed piping in sight.
Because we've already had, in expanding the show past Whale and Yutani into the Prodigy world, we've already expanded the aesthetic of Alien. So, I never really looked at it that way of saying, well, what's the H.R. Giger version of all of these creatures? I just tended to think of like what their functionality was.
Of all the show's new creatures, the eye octopus is almost certainly destined to become a fan favourite. Little more than a gelatinous eyeball mounted atop a wriggling mass of gory tentacles, this tiny terror is able to insert itself into a vacated eye socket and control its victim like a meat puppet. Such a simple concept is the basis for some of Alien Earth's most striking and frightening scenes.
The eye is a very specific creature. How does it move? How does it get the eyeball out of there? How does it get in there? How do the pupils work? All of it. And we have this fear of our bodily autonomy. You talked about the sort of literal reproductive nature of what the face hugger does, in a way that feels super invasive. And I just moved up a hole, right, to the eye. But the idea that this creature of this, limited size could remove our eye, which is a horrifying visual and thought, and then plug itself into any animal's nervous system, brain, etc., and take control of them. So I think the idea with the eye is really like, well, what's the agenda? It gets into your brain, and then why? What does it want to accomplish,
The brilliance of the eye occasionally threatens to overshadow the actual alien in Alien Earth. But ultimately, there's nothing that compares to cinema's perfect organism. The journey to the small screen has done nothing to change that, even if this version of the xenomorph isn't quite the one you've seen before. Every director has had their own vision for this creature, so it's seen many subtle changes across the years. See the head ridges of Cameron's Warrior variants, or David Fincher's dog-like runners. For Alien Earth, Hawley had a few changes of his own to make, as well as rules to follow.
I had to protect the silhouette. You know, my suit performer was not 7.5 feet tall. I was okay with that. You know, he had a more muscular body, so the you know a lot of the suit changes based on who the performer is, and I know that Fede went animatronic with his creatures to make them as skinny as possible. For me, the creature works best when we think of it as more as a quadruped. You know, the more that you're down on all fours, the more the head is back, the shorter the smokestacks have to be in the back, etc. So there were some functional shifts that we did. There were elements about it that I especially in long form storytelling, I'm going to be working with these things for many years, I hope. If I want it to be more of a quadruped, then we have to get into motion studies and working with the stunt crew. None of us are fast running around on all fours, so you need to help a suit performer on that level. And for me, the sort of rib cage always bothered me, because it feels very much like a human rib cage, and so I went with more of a sort of crustacean kind of feel in a couple of places. It's more of a cockroach brown than the classic black. You know, I do find that people always try to make things scarier by making their teeth sharper, right? And I'm like, well, I actually find the flatter teeth to be more worrisome. You know, that looks like it would hurt.
Helming an alien project doesn't just mean you get to make alterations to the xenomorph's appearance though. You also get to dictate what it does and where it goes. So what was Hawley's big ambition now that he had the alien on his own leash?
There's something primeval about seeing these creatures in a natural environment, you know, seeing them move through the jungle and, you know, where they become more real in a way. You know, it's not the abstraction of space, it's, you know, it's your neighborhood now. And you know, but it's also, an ecosystem is also, it's filled with life. And how does that life react when a new apex predator enters it?
That's a question that can only be answered by watching the show. But there's more to Alien's ecosystem than just plants and animals. The series has always explored the symbiotic relationship between victim and parasite, but that parasite isn't always organic in nature. Frequently, it is corporate and capitalistic, forcing regular working people through the ringer of space in hunt of profit, fortune, and the ultimate bioweapon.
You know, I mean, I think that if you think about this Alien as the story of these individuals who are kind of powerless within a faceless, nameless system, you know, I see them almost as Beckett characters. They're going to a place they don't know where to do a thing they don't know what for people they don't know who, right? There's, you know, and they're all expendable, you know, so they too are kind of drones in a way, but drones who think that they're autonomous beings. And I think we all think that. I think we all think, certainly in you know, modern times, that we're all, you know, bright, unique unicorns who you know, whose every thought is meaningful, etc. And the idea that we're just food like, you know, every other animal or you know, or a host for a parasite, yeah, it's creepy.
Creepy horrors from both the darkest depths of space and behind the desk of a CEO can be found in every episode of Alien Earth, which airs a new episode each week on FX and Hulu. For more on this exciting new show, check out our spoiler-free review and your questions answered by the show's cast. And for everything else, stick with IGN.